So, What If Alt Hist is one of the largest history channels on YouTube, and I put history in quotation marks because he doesn't really talk much about real history. Ever since he consumed too much ayahuasca and met God and Satan and then brainwashed himself into believing he was a prophet and tried to start a cult, which are all true things that actually happened.
Ayahuasca basically fried my brain.
He mostly talks about edgy psychobabble, like this entire reality is a lie, and everything is mate suppression. He does have a history podcast recommended by Elon Musk himself, which has extremely little value. It's mostly just him making weird jokes.
I'm pregnant.
Or half remembering history factoids while his desperate co-host struggles to keep him on track. I thought about reviewing some of those episodes, but they're not even worth going over. Here's the thing though, What If Alt Hist was never good, I'm sorry to tell ya. Of course, that's a subjective measurement, but there's an easy way to objectively test What If Alt Hist's understanding of the world by seeing if his future predictions made in the past have come to be true. This is what, why, how, and that's what the video's about. If you like this sort of thing, why not like, subscribe, and support the channel on patreon.com/whatwhyhow to get early access to future videos. First, let's look at What If Alt Hist's video, Why the 2024 Election Will Start a Civil War.
I've been predicting America will have a civil war or revolution since 2020. Back then, this sort of thing appeared distant, like something you would read about in a history book. The scary thing is that now it's real. My friends at the Stitch and Adams podcast like to say wars like this go from people LARPing to until they stop and the LARPing turns real. Hitler was LARPing conquering Eastern Europe. The communists were LARPing revolution and the American South was LARPing secession. It's all fun and games until the Nerf guns get replaced for AR-15s. The scary thing.
I don't want to get bogged down in this, but this is absolute meaningless BS. Germany wasn't LARPing conquering Europe before it did conquer Europe. It was rebuilding its military and actually conquering land like Austria and Czechoslovakia before it invaded Poland, then eventually the Soviet Union. The communists weren't LARPing revolution. If you look at the major communist revolutions in Russia and China, you'd see prolonged struggles with actual real-world effort before the start of fighting. In China, for example, the communists built up their power in a real, material way for years before fighting began in 1927. They only succeeded in 1949. In the American Civil War, fighting didn't pop out of nowhere in April 1861 when the South attacked Fort Sumter. Everybody knows about the growing struggle over slavery, which included plenty of actual violence beforehand, like Bleeding Kansas and the raid on Harper's Ferry. So no, actually, civil wars don't start with LARPing, they build up with actual violence. While there's plenty of tension in the United States today, and back then in 2024 when he made this video, there's just not anything comparable in scope to the 1850s. There might be in the future, but there definitely wasn't back in early 2024 when What If Alt Hist made this video. Obviously, his prediction is untrue. The United States did not collapse into a civil war during the 2024 election or beforehand. And his fans in the comments might say, well, give it some time. It's 2026. The 2024 election did not cause a civil war. Let it go. Any civil war that happens in the future, which is unlikely, will be caused definitionally by something else besides the 2024 presidential election. We're not in a cold civil war either, that's just what politics always is. Also, he's wrong that 2024 saw some unprecedented escalation of tensions that last occurred in 1860 or whenever. The things he mentions are 1. States trying to take major candidates off the ballot. 2. A state trying to ban guns. 3. States offering to help Texas defend the border. The first one is incorrect, because southern states did not remove Abraham Lincoln from the ballot in the South back in 1860. Governments didn't print the ballots back in 1860, parties did, and the new Republican Party wisely realized they had no chance of winning the South, so they didn't even bother printing their ballots there. At most, you could probably compare it to what happened after the Civil War when the federal government tried its best to keep Confederates off the ballot and out of government. They ultimately didn't do very well, which of course has parallels to modern day. It takes 1 second of research to figure this all out, yet What If Alt Hist can't even do that. Obviously his point is that tensions are escalating, and this is a piece of evidence, but his comparison is non-existent. The next claim is that New Mexico was trying to ban guns. This is not true either. After a series of mass shootings, New Mexico tried to temporarily ban guns in major urban areas, of which New Mexico has very few. The order was quickly thrown out by a judge. This was actual LARPing. The governor probably knew it would get thrown out immediately, but just wanted to look like he was doing something. I don't see how this could be interpreted as a precursor to civil war, though. It's not like it was part of rising tensions between Republicans and Democrats. The third thing he mentions is Republican states signing a letter supporting Texas in a legal dispute with the government. The worst this dispute got was the National Guard briefly forbidding Border Patrol from entering an area. This is far from the only time something like this has happened since 1860. Does nobody remember all the times the government federalized National Guards during the 1950s and 1960s? What about the time thousands of veterans marched on Washington, D.C. before getting their faces kicked in by MacArthur and Patton during the Great Depression? None of those cases led to civil war. The truth is, any level-headed analysis would measure the current level of tension in the United States far below that of the 1850s, probably closer or equal to the 1960s. Now, that's not a good thing, obviously, but I don't think we're likely to have Gavin Newsom ordering men in the field against the US Army anytime soon. Next, What If Alt Hist goes into his deciding factors section, which are, of course, BS. He does his usual cyclical Peter Turchin shtick.
His computer model has predicted the Russian Revolution, French Revolution, Roman Civil Wars, Black Death, or the religious wars of the 17th century to the exact periods they took place in based off 3 variables.
First of all, exact periods is a funny phrase, but obviously this is all BS. Peter Turchin came up with his formula crap after all those events happened. That's like if I coded my Excel election generator with the foreknowledge of what results I wanted, then said the election generator predicted those results. If I projected that code into the future, I would have no idea if the model would make an accurate prediction because it is impossible to know how variables might change or what new variables might become important in the future. Also, it's hilarious that What If Alt Hist says Peter Turchin predicted the Black Death. Was the Black Death a social crisis? Was it a civil war? No, it was a disease. Why would a model that predicts social tensions predict the spread of a disease? That makes no sense. I checked out Peter Turchin's website, and even with the benefit of hindsight which he brings to these models, they don't make accurate predictions. I mean, they're kind of neat, but here's the graph that What If Alt Hist shows, which supposedly measures the well-being of the American public. As you can see, the 1850s over there are part of a downward trend in well-being, supposedly. But the 1960s, another decade of social tension, are near the peak of well-being. The 1990s, during which political tension in America wasn't really that bad at all comparably, is at the end of a decline of well-being, supposedly more significant than that preceded the last Civil War. So doesn't this graph suggest that there should have been a civil war between Bill Clinton and George H.W. Bush if these factors are at all relevant in whether or not America has a civil war? What's the commonality here? The next graph What If Alt Hist shows is this one, which supposedly depicts elite overproduction. Except the 1850s, which were a time of immense social tension, see only a moderate increase in elite overproduction. The 1960s come after a significant decline of elite overproduction. The 2010s come after a massive spike. So how on earth is this predicting anything? These sorts of retroactive mathematical formulas always cherry pick their data, except Peter Turchin hasn't even done that well if he's trying to predict civil wars because there's no correlation here. So using this to predict whether or not America will have a civil war doesn't really make much sense. Next, What If Alt Hist says,
our society is managed by vast impersonal bureaucracies, so the left can manage all the large institutions, whether Hollywood, the media, Wall Street, corporations, the high ranks of the military, the churches, presidency, government bureaucracy, and tech. One of the ways I hone my...
I talk about this in one of my last videos about What If Alt Hist, but this is obvious BS again. Education in Hollywood, sure, we can say are all libbed up. The government is a ridiculously vague term. Which government? The national government? Which part? Corporations, the military, and churches are also obviously not left-wing. It's not a secret we can look at the political loyalties of the richest and most powerful people in America, and they're all leaning conservative, or outright conservative. Let's go to open secrets. The top donor of the 2024 election cycle, which this video is apparently about, was Elon Musk, who of course is the CEO of Tesla, SpaceX, and now the chairman of the company that owns Twitter, which What If Alt Hist says later on in the video is massively influential. So by any measurement, Elon Musk is a very powerful person, and obviously Elon Musk donated a gargantuan, filthy sum of money to Donald Trump. We can scroll past a bunch of the other richest and most powerful people in America, just about all of whom donated exclusively to the Republicans. A bunch of powerful tech CEOs also donated millions to Trump's inauguration fund. What about Walmart, the largest corporation in America? Well, Walmart PAC has mostly donated to Republicans over the past 25 years. Amazon, roughly equal between Republicans and Democrats. So the business elite are definitely conservative, and the PACs created for their companies tend to be equal or lean conservative. There's just no evidence to claim that these parts of society are left-wing. The issue here, and this is the truth, is that conservatives like to pretend they're the counterculture, while the truth is they've just gone nose-blind to their own power. What If Alt Hist rants about some other stuff for a while before saying this.
For all of these reasons, I think the right has a very large advantage over the left. That being said, it's hard for me to get further than that. The world is chaotic, and one of my catchphrases is that I'm betting against God. What that means is that there are a million ways to be wrong and only a handful to be right. Almost all predictions of the future are wrong, and so will mine be. Anyone who claims any other standard is a charlatan. I have a solid amount of correct and incorrect predictions under my belt. Keep in mind, I'm a 22-year-old with no credentials. Listen to me at your own risk.
Let's look at the screen to see what predictions he says he got right. Number 1, which is evidently the one he's most proud of, is predicting the invasion of Ukraine to the exact week. Wow, that sounds really impressive. Except as far as I can tell, he's talking about a video he released called What's Going On in Ukraine on February 18th, 2022. In case you don't remember, the United States government said Russia was about to invade Ukraine on February 11th. What If Alt Hist knows this because he includes a screen cap of this very article in his video. Should he get credit for agreeing with what the US government predicted? What If Alt Hist, probably by a coin flip, managed to get the right answer. Thanks not evidently to his own knowledge of the world, but because the US government told him it was gonna happen. His other predictions include Ethiopia's civil war, but anyone with a passing knowledge of Ethiopia could have predicted the country would have a civil war. Next he says the rise of the new right, which makes no sense. Next he says China turning Maoist, which isn't true. China is not Maoist. Xi Jinping is not a Maoist. The next two are America falling towards civil war and wokeness spiraling into further craziness in 2021. Both of which are so vague and broad that he does not deserve credit for predicting them if they're even true. The last one, the collapse of the Liberals in Canada, isn't even true. The Liberals didn't collapse. The rest of the video isn't really worth going over, but here are some highlights.
Societies experience the same emotions and mental illnesses that individuals do. A great failing of our society is that we need a spreadsheet or scientific study to say what's obvious to anyone with a supple mind. It's obvious women are more emotional than men. I communicate with women differently due to that. It's obvious that America is a better country than Mexico, given tens of millions of Mexicans immigrated here, and the reverse didn't happen. If a guy is charging you with a machete, you should be scared. The thing is that if you just look outside, it's obvious to me that we're about to have a civil war. This is kinda cringe since the worst people say this, but I think I might be an empath. I can't help but pick up on the emotions of the people around me. When I'm in a city, I can feel a certain vibe based off that city. When I speak before a crowd, I feel that it has an energy that I can almost play like a musician. The thing is that the vibes today are absolutely horrible. Far worse than they have been at any previous point in my life. I've stopped going to major cities anymore since the vibes are just too bad. It feels like nails on a chalkboard. Everyone's depressed. Everything's deteriorating, the air feels like tar. If I'm honest, nature, away from the human world, is where I find solace now. I have two friends who are professional experts in body language and language usage. They say that the language and actions now show that we will have a civil war soon.
This is great foreshadowing of What If Alt Hist saying he has psychic energy powers at the end of 2024.
I can channel, where when I touch this wood, I'm pulling energy from the wood. Knock on wood. When I pull from the air, I can feel the force of the air. And I feel happy when I can have life force. My strongest ability is the ability to use life force. And it's how I relate to you. It's how I made this video. It's how I communicate with my audience. It's how I communicate with the past. And so when I talk to someone, I can feel you. And I can feel all around you. I can feel your body. And I can feel inside of you. My life has gotten way too weird, and I need to share this with you so I don't go crazy, because we need to develop
What Odin said is he said, "You are married to your people now."
What if Alt Hist's soul is being torn apart right before our very eyes between a facts and logic Ben Shapiro ripoff and a pre-Enlightenment scared of thunder pagan? I don't want to bully him too much, of course, since his overall point that people in general are getting angrier about politics seems intuitively true to me. Anyways, he basically rants for 30 more minutes about how terrible society is today, which is true, but doesn't mean we're gonna have a civil war. So on a lighter note, let's look at What If Alt Hist's video, 6 countries that will be superpowers by 2080.
The 1990s and early 2000s were a really weird era in history for a special reason. It was the first era in history in which there was only one world power. For all of history, various factions struggled life and death over often tiny parts of the world, while the larger empires were lucky to even conquer the majority of one continent. However, through the world wars, the number of great powers dwindled from somewhere beneath 10 before World War I to after the fall of the Soviet Union there just being one left, the United States of America.
In his map of major world powers in 1914, he includes a bunch of countries that were not actually major world powers in 1914. In Europe, he has Britain, France, Germany, Italy, the Netherlands, and Belgium. If we're including Belgium, why not include Spain or Portugal, which also had major overseas colonies? The only difference is Belgium was invaded by Germany, while the other two stayed out of World War I. And going to Asia, why on earth would you count China as a major world power in 1914? China was in the midst of a major domestic political crisis and was about to explode into decades of civil war that only ended after World War II. They were being colonized at this time period. Also, the map has a bunch of tiny mistakes geographically, but whatever. The reason this matters is because What If Alt Hist predictably plays very fast and loose with the term major power. What does that even mean? Because in the title of the video he uses a different term, superpower. Then later on, he uses both terms interchangeably throughout the video. And experts do actually use these terms differently. The word superpower picked up popularity after World War II to describe the 3 most powerful victors, the United States, the United Kingdom, and the Soviet Union. Superpower is obviously supposed to be stronger than world powers, or great powers. That's how it was used. So if Austria-Hungary or China can be categorized as a major power in 1914 despite being unable to project major power across the world, then how on earth can we count America as the only major world power in the 1990s like What If Alt Hist does? 1990s Russia and China were in pretty crappy positions, but better than the Chinese Republic in the 1910s. Also, both the UK and France retained some of their overseas colonies and have played an important role in NATO military actions since the 1990s, but apparently they're not major world powers, but Austria-Hungary was. But anyways, let's just keep listening.
From the fall of the Soviet Union until the 2008 financial crisis, the US was the preeminent military power. No one before or since was able to wield as much technological, military, economic, political, and cultural power as the US was in those years. However, due to a combination of idiotic American leadership and its nature abhors a vacuum, this unipolar world system ended. We're currently in a bipolar world system. There are 2 main powers in the whole world, China and the United States. Both of these nations maintain vast coalitions of lesser powers that they support.
Would it surprise you to learn this is a gargantuan oversimplification of the way the world works today, and there are a bunch of details that don't really make much sense. For example, why is India counted as fully part of the American coalition? Well, India definitely doesn't like China. They have friendly relations with Russia. Even back before 2021, they bought plenty of military equipment from Russia. He's kind of collapsing all the countries that oppose America into one single Chinese coalition, which is just not very accurate. Here's what he says next, though.
However, even this world system is becoming more transitory. We're currently seeing the process of the world becoming multipolar. If current trajectories continue, we'll see a return of the old world, where all sorts of regional powers competed with each other. This video is going to go through the list of countries that I think will become major powers. It's ordered by which countries I think are most plausible for being regional political powers. China doesn't get onto this list since it basically deserves a future video in of itself. With that out of the way, let's start.
Okay, he then reads a sponsorship, but I want to point out that now the word he's using is not major power or superpower, but instead regional power, a word that means nothing. Every medium-sized country that isn't in a civil war could arguably be categorized as a regional power. What is this? What's this video even about? He's mixing up every single term.
I view this video in a lot of ways as the flip side to my 5 countries that will collapse before 2040. The common thesis is that a global disorder is coming and some countries are going to lose in it and others will make massive gains. This is a list of those countries. The countries that will be able to ride the wave to be able to carve out important status in the world to come. There's a lot of really important factors going into this, which I cover in other videos in this geopolitics series like Why is the World Crazy and Wars of the 2020s and 30s, but a big factor here is that the US is entering an isolationist phase, and I've explained it in these other geopolitical videos I've been doing, but the heart of the matter is that economic, geopolitical, and demographic factors all converge to make the US stop caring about the world outside of the first world in the Americas. Both the Republicans and Democrats have isolationist agendas for the future. I don't see the US completely abandoning Europe, and the US will continue to fight China, but not a lot of effort will go into the Middle East, now that the US is oil independent, and Africa as well.
Okay, clearly this prediction is just not true. The problem with What If Alt Hist is that he sees one piece of evidence, like the US pulling out of Afghanistan, and extrapolates it to the long duration of world history. For example, it is true that Donald Trump was more isolationist in his first term than, say, George W. Bush. But President Donald Trump had a very active foreign policy during his first term, including a whole enemies to lovers arc with Kim Jong-un, sanctioning Iran and killing their most important general, trying to bring peace to the Middle East with the Abraham Accords, and bombing ISIS. These are things that happened before the video was made back in 2021. Meanwhile, by any objective standard, Joe Biden's foreign policy going into his presidency was far from isolationist. The Democratic Party platform of 2020 literally said, "We will revitalize the power and purpose of American diplomacy to compete in a more contested world. We will lead not just with the example of our power, but with the power of our example. We will place values at the center of our foreign policy, and we will reinvent alliances, partnerships, and international institutions to meet common challenges that no country can face on its own." This is the opposite of isolationism. But you know what? Maybe What If Alt Hist saw something nobody else saw. Has the United States actually become more isolationist since 2021? Obviously not. Joe Biden did withdraw from Afghanistan, that's true, but this was balanced out by providing a huge quantity of aid to Ukraine, and to a lesser degree, a substantial amount of aid to Israel. And it goes without saying that Donald Trump's foreign policy now is far from isolationism, considering the fact he's trying to topple governments and conquer foreign countries. This is kind of deal-breaking, since the whole premise of his video, as he describes it, is that these countries will fill up the vacuum left behind by an isolationist United States. So if there's no isolationist United States, these countries won't become superpowers, or regional powers, or major world powers, or whatever he says. In his page where he lists some additional reasons why America will become isolationist, he even says, "Without the Soviets, the US has no reason to be involved around the world." As if America was like uniquely opposed to the Soviet Union on its own, and not to any rival major country opposed to America's interests. As if Russia and China just don't exist. What If Alt Hist, your whole video on the inevitability of multipolar competition is premised on multipolar competition not existing. Won't America oppose whatever superpowers you come up with? Why wouldn't it? But you know what? This video doesn't make any sense, so let's just fast forward to 4 minutes in.
This whole system's about to end. This, alongside a couple other factors we're going to talk about as we move through this video, will allow certain countries to become dominant international players. These countries are listed here from what I think the least to most likely options are for them to become great powers in the next 60 years.
Okay, so What If Alt Hist has used the terms major power, superpower, regional power, great power, now dominant international player, all of which are like separate categories. A regional power is very different from a dominant international player or even a superpower. What is this video even about? Okay, let's just listen to his first country he provides.
Number 6, the East African Federation. This is a weird one. It's one of those low-chance empires that I put little stock in their long-term success, but has like a 1 in 10 or so shot of becoming a major power. First of all, I find the sheer possibility of this country's existence somewhat bizarre and unrealistic, but as of now, it's going to occur. The countries of Kenya, Tanzania, Uganda, Rwanda, Burundi, and South Sudan are supposed to unify to form a single mega-country in 2023, with Arusha and Tanzania as its capital. If this were to occur, it would be the biggest border shift since the end of the Soviet Union. The country would have a population of 190 million, making it the 8th most populous country in the world.
In case you didn't know, the East African Federation doesn't exist. It didn't form in 2023, and anyone who knew anything about these countries would know that it was never gonna happen, and it's still not gonna happen. Now you might say I'm holding What If Alt Hist to an unfair standard, but you know what? I made my own future predictions back in 2022, and I purposefully and knowingly did not predict the East African Federation would form because, again, nobody with any knowledge of this area would assume that it would. By now, by the way, the Congo and Somalia have joined this proposed country, meaning it will definitely not happen. Why would any of these governments agree to join some federation? Is there some major outside threat driving them to join? No. Instead, the threat is domestic. These governments can't even maintain control of their own countries, especially Somalia, South Sudan, and the DRC. This is strong evidence that they're not going to form some supranational union. And it's not the first time in history that post-colonial countries have tried and failed to create regional federations. Back after World War II, the newly independent Arab countries tried to form bold new federations, none of which lasted very long. I don't want to be too harsh on What If Alt Hist because he says the East African Federation is only the 6th most likely superpower of 2080 and not the most likely one, but come on, Kenya and Tanzania do have relatively high GDPs, but they're not even at the top of the list for Africa. He then talks for a couple minutes about his predictions for Africa as a whole. He says,
Sub-Saharan Africa doesn't really have a strong imperial tradition. With 50 nations, once the international systems leaves, I see Africa becoming a laboratory of nation building. With 50 nations with such cultural diversity, what are the chances one spawns a Harun al-Rashid, Charlemagne, or Augustus? It might not be the East African Federation, but I think they're the most likely choice of anyone now. The normal progression of history is that empires form around the edges of the previously developed world. Almost every state formed this way, as some warlord on the edges of a developed society united a people together, importing the techniques of the more developed neighboring society. If you let states wage war with each other, the strongest will survive, and they'll adopt technology from the world around them. In a Hobbesian world without America, this process will happen somewhere in Africa.
Now here, What If Alt Hist is making a ton of assumptions without any real evidence. One is the major foundational assumption that America will become isolationist, of course. But implicit in that assumption is that no other world power will replace America on the world stage and play kingmaker in African politics. For example, if China, India, or Europe compete for power in Africa in the future, why wouldn't they cut the knees out of any ambitious African Augustus by sponsoring their rivals with the inevitable timeless strategy of divide and conquer? Compare this to the United States kicking Iraq out of Kuwait. Why wouldn't China kick Tanzania out of Kenya if they had the power to do so, which they might in 2080? But also, What If Alt Hist is making another foundational assumption with no real evidentiary basis, which is that the future of Africa is comparable to things that he knows about, mainly classical and medieval history, mostly European history. Why? Why will Africa in the future, which has immensely unique circumstances, follow previous patterns of history? For all we know, global warming and Malthusian pressures will both mean Africa will have a huge crisis at some point in the 21st century. That's a quote from What If Alt Hist. He says those exact words, but he assumes this crisis will result in some larger empire and not simply cause African countries to descend into a new millennium of prolonged civil war and division. I hope they don't do that, but why would you assume otherwise? Why would you assume that? You need actual evidence.
Number 5. Iran. Iran has always been a major power. If you accept the 20th and late 19th centuries, there really hasn't been a time since Socrates that Iran wasn't in the top 10, or more commonly 5 most powerful countries on the planet.
Yeah, this isn't true. Ever since the Mongol invasion of the 1200s, during which Mongol soldiers massacred hundreds of thousands of people, Persia has not been a major world power. You can definitely argue the Timurids were a strong regional power in the 1400s, but their capital was in what is now Afghanistan. The Safavid dynasty, while definitely a regional power, spent most of the 1500s and 1600s getting beaten up by the Ottomans. Historian Homa Kutuzyan describes the 1700s as a dark period in Iranian history. Apart from 2 decades of relative peace, it was a period when on many an occasion it looked as if the country would be broken up as badly as before, especially as the Ottomans and the Russians took advantage of the situation and occupied parts of Iranian territory. The whole of the 1800s, not just the late 1800s as What If Alt Hist says, were a decline of Persian power. My point is, Iran isn't a natural international power. If we looked at history and just blindly applied it to today, we would predict that the Taliban or some Central Asian dictator would invade Iran and impose a new dynasty. I do think it's definitely possible that Iran will be a strong regional power in 2080 because it is a strong regional power today. It's not going to be a superpower though, which is what the title of the video is. Also, Here's a nitpick, but he uses this map of the Safavid Empire, but adds a big label saying it's from 1700. It's definitely not from 1700, but instead probably the 1500s, during the peak of Safavid power. He just says 1700 for no reason. His next predictions are Ethiopia, India, France, and Turkey. I think these are fair predictions for powerful regional countries, though I don't think any of them will rise to the position of superpower by 2080. India might be a superpower in the next century based on its size alone, but that doesn't seem especially likely to me. If I had to predict countries likely to be superpowers in a true sense of the word by 2080, I'd say that there's a 70% chance that the United States remains a superpower. I'd give a 50% chance that China becomes a superpower too, depending on whether or not current trends continue or the country plateaus. And I'd give a 30% chance to Europe becoming a superpower if the continent becomes more unified in opposition maybe to Russia or the United States. These are, by the way, believe it or not, the top 3 economies in the world today. India is a much smaller possibility, and the countries he lists besides India are not very likely at all. So, in summary, What If Alt Hist is really bad at making future predictions, which casts a lot of doubt on his understanding of the world and his understanding of his own abilities. If he consistently makes such crappy predictions, then maybe he doesn't really know much about what he's talking about. Now, of course, my predictions are far from perfect, but I think they're a little bit more rational. You can click on this link over here if you want to watch those. And you know what? If you want to support the channel, you can do so on patreon.com/whatwhyhow. For $1 a month, you can get early access to future videos. Thanks to those already do, and adios.